prepare to have your history books ripped to shreds. You think you know the Tudors? Think again. We're diving into the raw, unvarnished truth about how England's most famous dynasty was built on the broken body of a child. May 31st, 1443. Innocence enters the world at Bleo Castle, Bedfordshire. Margaret Beaufort, a baby girl. Already she's not a child, she's a pawn. Her father, John Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, holds power like a clenched fist. But power is fleeting. Less than a year later, the Duke is found dead, suicide whispered in hushed tones. Scandal taints everything. Suddenly, baby Margaret isn't just an heiress, she's vulnerable. She's a treasure chest without a guard transom. Dao Kojien, classical oil painting. Viet tat ka bong tiangan moi prompt kach hao kshuang mut. Jong chotoi file text jitoi. Copy mut load the vulture circle. Their eyes glinting with greed. This 1-year-old inherits land, titles, a fortune that would make grown men weep with envy. Her mother, Margaret Beaufort, tries to shield her daughter, raises her with love, and gives her an education. The girl learns to read French. Her intelligence blossoms. But the real world cares little for a child's intellect. King Henry VI intervenes. When Margaret is barely 3, he hands her over like a prize to William de Pole, the Duke of Suffolk. A predator's grin spreads across Suffolk's face. He marries the toddler to his 7-year-old son, John, a 3-year-old bride. Pause. Let that sink in. The child probably didn't even understand the words of the wedding. The ceremony was likely conducted between January and February 1450, although some documents suggest an earlier date. Papal dispensation is required because the children are related. The Pope grants it in August 1450. Even the church is complicit in this monstrous charade, but Suffolk's plan implodes. By 1453, he's arrested and murdered, his political star extinguished. Little Margaret is back on the market, a prize unclaimed. This is where the real horror begins. King Henry VI makes a decision that will shatter her life. He gives her to the Tudor brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, half-brothers to the king, born from his mother's second marriage to Owen Tudor, a Welsh servant. They are ambitious, ruthless, and have the king's ear. When Edmund Tudor looks at 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, he doesn't see a child. He sees a fortune, a womb, his future. The wedding is set for November 1st, 1455. Margaret is 12, Edmund is 24. The stage is set for unspeakable tragedy. What follows is not just a historical event, it's a violation. Even in medieval England, where child marriages were common, there was a line. You didn't consummate the marriage until the girl was at least 14, preferably older. Not out of compassion, but out of practicality. They knew pregnancy could kill young girls. Edmund Tudor ignores the unspoken rule, breaks the social contract, and crosses the line into monstrous territory. Days after the wedding, perhaps on the wedding night itself, this 24-year-old man sexually assaults a 12-year-old child. Let's call it what it is. Margaret cannot legally consent. She cannot emotionally consent. Her body isn't physically ready. Historian Elizabeth Norton states it bluntly. It was perfectly acceptable to marry a child in the 15th century, but you didn't have sex with them while they were a child. Edmund had his reasons. Cold, calculating reasons. In medieval law, if an heiress died without children, her lands reverted to her family. But if she died after giving birth, her husband kept everything for life. Edmund looked at this 12-year-old girl and made a horrifying calculation. The sooner he got her pregnant, the sooner he secured his fortune, even if it killed her. He saw her not as a person, but as a means to an end, a vessel to carry his claim to wealth and power. He gambled with her life, and the stakes were her very existence. This is the darkness at the heart of the Tudor story, the foundation upon which their dynasty was built. By April 1456, Margaret is pregnant. She is still 12 years old. Imagine being 12 and realizing your body is changing in ways you don't understand. Imagine the terror of morning sickness when you're barely out of childhood yourself. Imagine the confusion and fear as your belly swells with a baby you never asked for, planted there by a man who saw you as nothing more than a walking bank account. This is not a story of romance or destiny. This is a story of violation, of the theft of innocence. But Margaret's nightmare is about to intensify. In July 1456, Edmund Tudor is captured by Yorkist forces during the Wars of the Roses. He is imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle, and by November, on their first wedding anniversary, he is dead. The official cause? Plague. Whispers of other possibilities abound. Margaret is now 13, 7 months pregnant, and utterly alone. Abandoned by fate and circumstance, she faces the world with only the burden of motherhood to guide her. She could have stayed at Llandifai, resigned to her fate. But Margaret is made of sterner stuff. Despite being heavily pregnant, despite it being winter, despite the very real danger of traveling during a civil war, she makes the journey to Pembroke Castle, seeking the protection of her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. The journey alone could have killed her. Riding over rough roads through hostile territory, her young body already pushed beyond its limits. Each step she takes is a testament to her strength, each breath a defiance of the forces that seek to break her. She arrives at Pembroke Castle. On January 28, 1457, Margaret's real ordeal begins. Labor starts, and immediately something is wrong. Margaret is tiny for her age. Contemporary accounts consistently describe her as small and slight. Her hips haven't widened. Her body hasn't finished growing. She is a child trying to do what a woman's body is designed for, but she is not yet a woman. The baby is coming, but there is nowhere for it to go. Hour after hour, the agony continues. The midwives exchange frightened glances. They have delivered hundreds of babies, but this is different. This is not a woman in labor. This is a child whose body is tearing itself apart. The room becomes a battleground, the screams a symphony of pain. The specifics of what happened in that room are lost to history, but we can piece together the horror from what came after. The birth is so traumatic, so damaging that Margaret never has another child, despite remarrying twice. In an age where women routinely had 10, 12, 15 children, where producing heirs was a wife's primary duty, Margaret Beaufort only ever has one. Her body is so destroyed by giving birth at 13 that it never recovers. The physical toll is immense, but the psychological scars run even deeper. The baby survives. They name him Henry, the future Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. But survival comes at a cost that Margaret will pay for the rest of her life. John Fisher, Margaret's confessor and close friend, delivers a sermon after her death in 1509. He reveals something that shows just how close to death she came that January day. He calls it a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. Even 50 years later, in an age that didn't blink at child marriage, Fisher is still shocked that someone so small, so young, had survived childbirth. A miracle born of unimaginable suffering. Survival is not the same as being okay. Modern medical knowledge helps us understand what likely happened to Margaret's body. When a girl gives birth before her pelvis is fully developed, the baby can become stuck in the birth canal. The pressure can cause devastating damage. Tissue death, fistulas, permanent scarring. The prolonged labor Margaret endured would have made everything worse. She likely suffered injuries that would be considered catastrophic, even with modern medical care. The physical damage would haunt her for the rest of her days, and the psychological trauma? Unfathomable. A 13-year-old girl orphaned by her father's suicide, sexually assaulted by her husband, widowed while pregnant, and then nearly killed bringing his child into the world. Is it any wonder that Margaret's relationship with her son becomes the defining obsession of her life? Some historians have described her love for Henry as bordering on obsessive, and suggested it might have been a trauma response to almost losing both their lives during his birth. A desperate attempt to cling to the one thing she salvaged from the wreckage of her childhood. But the story doesn't end with survival. It transforms. Margaret Beaufort learns from her horror. She becomes a force to be reckoned with. Decades later, when her own granddaughter, another Margaret, Margaret Tudor, is betrothed to the King of Scotland at a young age, Margaret Beaufort fights against it. She and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, lobby Henry VII frantically. Margaret's own son recorded her words. "The Queen and my mother are very much against this marriage. They fear the King of Scots would not wait but injure her and endanger her health." Think about that. 50 years after her own trauma, Margaret is still haunted by what happened to her. She knows exactly what not waiting means. She knows what it does to young girls' bodies. She's lived it. But even knowing this, even having suffered through it herself, the political machine grinds on. Young Margaret Tudor is sent to Scotland anyway, married at 13, just like her grandmother. The cycle continues, a haunting echo of the past. This is what makes Margaret Beaufort's story so much more than just a historical tragedy. It's a window into how power worked in medieval England, how women's bodies were commodified, and how even victims of the system could become complicit in perpetuating it. She becomes one of the most powerful women in England, the king's mother, a political mastermind who helped orchestrate the Tudor rise to power. But she never escapes that room in Pembroke Castle. She never has another child. And when she tries to protect her granddaughter from the same fate, she fails. The chains of history bind her, even as she strives to break free. Modern historians have tried to soften this story. They talk about different times and different standards. They point out that Margaret seemed to retain affection for Edmund's memory. She asked to be buried beside him, not her later husband's. But trauma does strange things to people. Stockholm Syndrome wasn't a term in the 15th century, but the psychology behind it is timeless. When you're 12 years old and the most powerful people in your world tell you this is normal, that this is God's will, that this is your duty, what choice do you have but to internalize it? She embraced her fate, not because she wanted to, but because she was conditioned to. The truth is that even by medieval standards, what happened to Margaret Beaufort was recognized as wrong. The typical age for consummation was 14 at minimum, often later. Noble families routinely negotiated contracts that specifically forbade consummation until the bride was older. The fact that Edmund Tudor ignored these conventions, that he chose to impregnate a 12-year-old for financial gain, was shocking even to his contemporaries. But they let it happen anyway because Margaret wasn't really a person to them. She was property that could be traded, sold, and used as her owners saw fit. The king who gave her to Edmund, the nobles who witnessed the wedding, the priests who blessed the union, they all knew what would happen to her, and they did nothing. This is the system that created the Tudor dynasty. This is the suffering that put Henry VII on the throne. Every Tudor monarch who followed, Henry VIII with his 6 wives, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, they all traced their lineage back to a 13-year-old girl who nearly died giving birth because a grown man couldn't wait 2 more years to secure his fortune. The glamour of the court, the power and prestige, all mask the brutal reality upon which it was built. Margaret Beaufort survived. She even thrived in her way. She founded colleges at Cambridge. Christ College and St. John's College still honor her as their foundress. She became a patron of education, a political powerhouse, a woman who signed herself Margaret R., as if she were a queen in her own right. But success doesn't erase trauma. Achievement doesn't undo damage. When she died on June 29, 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday, Margaret Beaufort had outlived 4 husbands, seen her son become king, and her grandson, Henry VIII, inherit the throne. She'd accumulated vast wealth and power. She'd shaped the course of English history. But she'd never had another child. Her body never recovered from what Edmund Tudor did to her when she was 12 years old. A ghost of the past haunted her every step, a constant reminder of the price she paid for power. This is the part of the story that gets lost in the glamour of Tudor history. We talk about Henry VIII's wives, about Elizabeth I's golden age, about the Tudor Rose and the break with Rome. We don't talk about the child bride whose suffering made it all possible. We don't talk about how the Tudor dynasty was built on the broken body of a 13-year-old girl. The truth is buried beneath layers of propaganda and romanticized narratives, but it cannot be ignored. Margaret's story is still relevant today. In a world where child marriage still exists, where young girls are still traded like property, where their bodies are still seen as commodities to be exploited, Margaret Beaufort stands as a reminder of what happens when we fail to protect children. She survived, yes, she even conquered. But at what cost? The midwife who delivered Henry Tudor that day in Pembroke Castle probably went home thinking she'd witnessed a miracle. And in a way she had. It was a miracle that Margaret survived. It was a miracle that Henry survived. But it was a preventable miracle, one that should never have been necessary if the adults in Margaret's life had done their job and protected her. Instead, they sacrificed her childhood, her body, and her future children on the altar of political ambition. She deserves to have her story told in full, not just the powerful woman she became, but the brutalized child she was. Because until we acknowledge the real cost of power, until we face the human suffering behind the grand narratives of history, we're doomed to repeat the same cruelties. The silence surrounding Margaret's suffering is a form of complicity, a way of normalizing the exploitation she endured. Margaret couldn't save her granddaughter. She couldn't undo what was done to her, but maybe by telling her story honestly, by refusing to look away from the horror of it, we can at least honor her memory. The real Margaret Beaufort, the child who survived the unsurvivable, the girl who built a dynasty on the ruins of her own body. She was 12 years old. Never forget that. In all the glory of Tudor history and all the pageantry and power, never forget that it started with a 12-year-old girl who nearly died because the adults who should have protected her chose profit over her life instead. That's the horror at the heart of the Tudor Rose. That's the blood that stained the throne. That's the price Margaret Beaufort paid for a dynasty she never asked to create. She was 12 years old, and that should have been enough to save her. That's the lesson we must learn from her story, a lesson that echoes through the centuries and demands our attention. Remember Margaret Beaufort. Remember the child. Remember the cost, and vow to never let it happen again. The legacy of the Tudor dynasty is forever stained with the blood and tears of a 12-year-old girl. Never forget that. Never forget that. Never forget that.